Intercultural Foundations, Urgencies in the Field. As seen from the history of international and intercultural education, there is an understanding that international education needs to move towards inclusion. What does inclusion mean? At its base, inclusion is about respect, being respected in all aspects of our identity because of our differences, not in spite of them or regardless of them. In international education, we experience so much cultural diversity. We have to be careful that we question our approaches to inclusion to ensure that this does not mean integration or assimilation. This is challenging because the current ways in which systems are set up to privilege some social groups and not others. The challenges in the field of international education and education as a whole ask us to examine the ways in which education has and continues to participate in creating inequities in societies. These inequities or urgencies are complex, historically based, and intertwining. Examples of this are colonialism and racism. Goulet and Goulet describe the relationship of colonization and racism in the following way. Colonization was and still is based on the ideologies of Eurocentrism and racism. In practice, the two ideologies are intertwined. Eurocentrism advocates and reinforces superiority by postulating that European language, knowledge, systems, and culture are superior, scientific, and civilized, while racism propagates inferiority. This binary relationship with Eurocentrism and the notion of the other constructs other peoples as different and separate from Europeans and thus not subject to the same treatment and laws. Foundational concepts that are key in critical intercultural approaches are understanding prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is a learned judgment about a social group that is not your own, which is based on limited understanding or experience. Prejudice is often based in stereotype. Discrimination is an action that is taken based on a prejudice. These tend to happen on a spectrum of experiences and understandings, from subtle to blatant. Because of the power of socialization, all individuals have prejudice and discriminate. Tied to the concepts of prejudice and discrimination is the concept of oppression. Oppression occurs beyond the level of the individual and is sometimes called a systemic issue. For example, colonization and racism are forms of oppression. These are built into systems through policy, practices, norms, and structures which function to oppress or press down one social group to the benefit of another. The social group that benefits from oppression is said to have power and privilege. Sensoy and D'Angelo came up with the formula discrimination and prejudice plus power equals oppression. As already noted, these systems are complex and interlocking. Because identities are composed of different groups such as race, gender, class, an understanding of intersectionality is important. Kimberly Crenshaw describes intersectionality as a prism to understand the ways in which forms of inequity compound and how one can simultaneously experience privilege and oppression in complex ways. For example, a student from international pathways that speaks fluent English and is white will experience privilege with respect to their language and race, whereas an international student who speaks fluent English and is racialized would still experience privilege with respect to their language, but also experience oppression with respect to their race. Both students still have to deal with learning Canadian customs, but one will not have the burden of dealing with racism. This work is complex and will require patience, persistence, and compassion, because while we learn about issues of race, gender, class, power, and privilege, we are also being asked to unlearn some of our socialized behaviors that are tied to our values and beliefs in the depths of our cultural iceberg. Part of what makes these conversations difficult are the many ways in which we have been socialized in Canada to minimize our differences. One of the ways this is expressed is in the unspoken understanding that polite people do not discuss differences, but instead focus on commonalities. Intercultural approaches have invited people to do both, to value our commonalities, but also to value our differences. Inclusion asks us to consider our impact and go beyond our good intentions. International education practices need to be informed by both critical intercultural approaches and equity examinations of power. As we embrace these approaches, we need to be prepared that there will be no simple solutions, and also be prepared to face our roles and responsibilities, both individually and collectively, in addressing the challenges and changes that are needed in international education.